Okay, so
good morning, everybody.
Just a few words before I give you the floor. So everybody who leaves today should remember to give back the badge to the secretary. It's an ICTP badge. So, by the way, I take this opportunity to thank the technical assistants of ICTP who are doing a fantastic job in connecting everybody and working also on holidays like today. Okay, so so another announcement is that after Matteo Valleriani's talk, we will take 5 minutes. Everybody should go out very quickly. We take a picture of everybody because some of us is leaving, so we would like to leave an image of them for our recollection in the future. Okay, so I leave the floor to the first session.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Gerd Grasshoff. I chair the early morning session. Early, it's a little over-exaggerated. We have 4 blocks. And as you said, after the first presentation, we will have an intermission for taking the group picture. Nobody should leave the hall, but gather here at the beginning of the podest for the group picture, and then we will continue with the other presentations. I will not lose too much time right now for the introduction. The speakers I'm happy to chair this morning are very well known since many decades to everybody. I'm very particularly fond and happy that we can have this first morning session like any other session on the behalf and to honor Jürgen's activities over the last decades. One never really can establish when they began. One knows that they will never end. So this is a symposium in the middle to present some glimpses of the huge field of activities and research that you did with all the people in the hall during the last decades. And so I don't want to lose more time, so we cannot even present all these activities, which I happen to follow at least from year to year, and show only some of the few highlights of the various projects in the presentation of this morning. And you will see how diverse the subjects, approaches. And I'm happy that the book that we also celebrate by Jürgen, The Evolution of Knowledge, it couldn't be a better title, and I couldn't even think of a different title which could gather all these different aspects, times and approaches and challenges in the history of science that we will present. So I ask Matteo to come for the first presentation. You need to leave to the airport rather soon, and my task is to get the discipline of time-wise into the group, which tends to discuss for usually more than 4 hours in traditional meetings of Jürgen's research groups. And it was always a pleasure to take part in such unconstitutional long discussion groups. But now, Matteo, and then we switch to China.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here and to give the second talk in honor of Jürgen in the turn of few months. So in the first one, it was online. It was an online event. I feel some background with me. I don't know if for you the audio is fine. So the first one was about the quadrivium as such. And the development of the quadrivium. Today we go a little bit deeper into one of the disciplines, astronomy, or better, cosmography, a connection between astronomy and you will see. And I will show to you some new results that we've never shown before. So let's start with a little introduction. What you are going to see today comes basically from this project. the sphere, knowledge system evolution, and the shared scientific identity of Europe. This project we work on, we prepared a collection of historical sources. These are introductory textbooks for the introductory class in astronomy, basically collected around one text, Ioannis de Sacrobosco de Sfera. But we use this text especially to find all other texts around that students were using. We focus on the printed editions. The first one printed in 1472, together with the Theorica Nova, the first scientific books ever printed in Europe. And then we move until 1650. So we cover about 180 years. With these sources, we have found 359 different textbooks that were used all over Europe. An average print run for the time, pretty usual, was about 1,000 copies. So then it means we are speaking about something like 350,000 books that were circulating and being used by students in the turn of 180 years. So this session is about spread of knowledge. So that's why I'm giving these figures. For us, historians, this means we have taken one copy for each print run, basically. And this, in total, it makes 76,000 pages of material to analyze. So these, you see the temporal and geographic distribution of the production of these books. And so basically it covers all over Europe, and the peak is about the half of the 16th century. So let's move into the zones. Before coming to the climate zones, a little introduction. So these textbooks are on astronomy and cosmology, and this is geocentric cosmology. So the Earth is in the middle. And then, according to the Orthodox theory, you would have the Earth, the element of Earth. Aristotelian theory is the heaviest one, so it's at the center of the world. Then you have the element of the water, and then air and fire. So with the Orthodox theory, there is obviously the little problem that there is no space for the human beings to live, to survive, because they would be staying under the water. So then the little ad hoc solution was developed to say that the element of the Earth is spherical, but it's just eccentric to the element of the water, so that there is a little piece of Earth coming out from the element of the water, which you see on the left side. And this is the oikumene, and where everyone is living. And then it is difficult to say exactly what is the relation between the picture on the left and the picture on the right, but maybe you imagine something like a rotation toward you. So you bring the oikumene in front of you. And at that point, you have the astronomic great circles, the tropics, the polar circles, the equinoctial, and you project them from the spherical cosmos onto the Earth. And in this way, you create 5 zones. And one of them is the habitable one, the inhabitable one, which is this one. So basically, what you see on the left is here more or less roughly on the right. So this is, close to the Tropic of the Cancers. This is where we are, according to this theory. So now we zoom into the inhabitable zone, and we have a further subdivision, which is the 7 climes. So, and these 7 climes, you would think immediately, so these are the parallels, but they are not. They are parallel to the equator, as our modern concept of parallels, but they are not at a regular distance among them. They depend, the position of these lines depends on the length of the solar day. So here you immediately understand that this concept is not a purely geometric concept. It's a geometric construction useful for other reasons. So the length of the solar days means connection with a lot of useful information concerning vegetation, or what we would say zoology. What was very, very important in the time was medicine, because most of the medicine was preventive medicine, which means, so according to the temperament, which was not a psychological concept in the time, but was rather a constitutive concept for human beings and latitudes on the planet. So now you would decide, for instance, a special diet. So how to eat in order to in order to have a healthy life. So these concepts are, are climbs, and they're connected to meteorology, medicine, astrology, 7 planets, 7 climbs, and so. But this is not the usual way you would present the climbs in this period. Way more typical is to have a table like this, where you have the 7 climbs. The 7 climbs were decided by, was already calculated in antiquity. It's ancient knowledge. Ptolemy's Almagest are there. And Ptolemy already said, oh, actually, we could also have 24 of them, but why we do it? We are going beyond the inhabitable zones. So he knew that there were people living in other places, but this is so uncomfortable to live there, so they would just ignore them. And this is the ancient knowledge that was transmitted until very late. And our first question was, for how long? As a matter of fact, this period we are taking into consideration is the period where, particular events took place, journeys of exploration. So people were starting knowing the world differently. And you see these 7 climbs, they just go from the equator to, let's say, half North Europe. And they were usually connotated by telling the main cities that were there, Alexandria, Rhodes, Rome. They were not going really up north so much. This is you really see the mirroring the ancient vision from Hippocrates first, and then Hipparchus and then Ptolemy. We had the question, so for how long were people studying this stuff? And by the way, there was also a side event like the publication of Copernicus in the middle of this time. Okay, so then we say, okay, the only thing we need to do is to find this table in all our publications. Okay, we discovered something we did not wish to discover. And the fact that we trained the machine learning algorithm, just a very easy one. We took the Google one, VGG16. We trained it. We put a few hundred pages with tables and a few hundred pages without tables to say, search all the tables. And the result was, unfortunately, that we found 10,000 pages of numerical tables, all printed in a different ways, with different formats. And even if you order them by time and space, like here in this Vicus viewer, so you will see this is not really helpful. So how do you find tables similar to a given one? Well, how do you cluster, according to similarity, 10,000 pages of tables? The question was easy, how long these 7 climbs were used, but the answer to the method to answer was not easy at all. So then, even if you look, for instance, at the CD like Venice, you see there are too many tables. You don't wish to do this job. So then so this was the task: find the same table. And here make a little digressions about something that we are going to publish and release this year, which is an unsupervised algorithm that is able to identify similar tables. Here are some further difficulties. Printers in the early modern time were all using different fonts. They were producing their own fonts. The font was a kind of insignia for them, so it was a way to be distinguished among them. Or a typical difficulty here is, you see on the in the other picture on the left side, you see one sinus table printed on one page. On the right side is the same table printed on 2 pages and horizontal. So you need your rotation invariance. So you have a lot of difficulties if you want to apply machine learning and computer vision in this aspect. So it's very, very difficult to enter. And if you want to do it manually, then you can imagine, so using the semantics, comparing cell by cell, number by numbers, because not all the tables have a title, and so far and so on, it becomes basically impossible for human beings. Here are other difficulties due to electronic reproductions. As you know, we are scanning, or libraries, archives are scanning historical sources since over 20 years. Meanwhile, there are kind of rules for post-production or production, but most of this material which is available now is extremely heterogeneous. Then you have problems like the book that cannot be opened too much, or the fact that many people thought, oh, but these are just tables, we don't need to fold them out and scan them. So you get prints like this, scans like this on the right side. Who is going to read them, you know? And So basically, yeah, it's not attainable to ask somebody to compare everything, all the numbers, and so we needed to find something to move on over this problem. And maybe for historians sounds crazy, but we gave up the idea to have any kind of semantic interpretation of these things in order to find the similar ones. So we really, made a step back, and we found another solution that basically means destroying the old semantic relations among the numbers that you can find in an astronomic or computational table, and just take the numbers, the single digits, and create a bag of digits. So we went through two steps. First, we trained a neural network for the recognition of single digits. It was pretty easy. We have, there are 11 possibilities, so from 0 to 9 plus background noise and so. And this doesn't require so much labeling work, and it was successful. This is a given technology. But then this was also prone to errors, and making a bag of single digits doesn't bring so far. So, and then we made some further tests, and we found out that by extending this idea into taking into consideration bigrams, 2 digits, this was way more significant to in order to be able to find similar tables. And so for each digit, find the next neighbor. And so basically it works in this way. So if you have 3 digits, then you have 2 bigrams. We already published on this to show the efficiency of this method. Information loss is then compensated by smaller recognition error. And the whole work then works like this. So we make a bag of bigrams, and we create an histogram for them, and then we actually compare the histograms. And when 2 histograms are similar, the 2 tables are similar. So there is a high correlation between the bigram histograms, and then this implies same table. It took about 3 years to do this. It sounds easy now, but it's not easy at all because of the heterogeneity of the material that we're working with. So at this point, the nice thing is that this algorithm creates clusters of similar tables, but fully unsupervised. We gave up all the semantics, so we don't have any idea what they are. As historians, this is obviously a problem. And the other nice aspect, however, is that you can project these clusters into an embedding space. And this means that you get all the clusters of similar tables close to each other, depending, or closer or more distant from each other, depending on the similarity among them. So if there is an overlap of bigrams and so. So this means that if you have a cluster of tables, of same tables, and there is another cluster that somehow is related to these because of the bigrams, then this other cluster is just positioned close to it. And we historians can start investigating these relations. And the first thing that we found out is that our research question was too simple. We were looking for the 7 climbs table, and we found out there is a 9 climbs table as well. So there is something that already diverged from the tradition, the Ptolemaic tradition. This basically goes up north, and it comes from the Protestant regions. It starts after the Protestant Reformation, and basically this means, well, we are also living here, and let's add 2 other stripes top to the north, so to include, Wittenberg and other places toward Poland. So this was an idea. This was the icebreaker to the tradition, and then the obvious. You would expect, because of the journeys of exploration, that they would receive this knowledge and say, well, it doesn't make any sense to have 7 climbs only in this place of Europe, but we need the climbs everywhere because there are the people everywhere, because there are other regions. And so you expect a 24 climb table, which was already existing in antiquity, but they just said that this was not relevant. And so we found also this, thanks to this system technological solution, we could see that there is an overlap or a closeness among these clusters of these tables. So for each of them, we have several hundreds, and I can already tell you that let's say we have the traditional ancient knowledge, Then we have the icebreaker 9 climbs, and then we have these interpreted as the modernity, the discovery of the world that is made in a different way. Yeah, symbolically for that, Amerigo Vespucci measuring height of the southern crust and making the stellar map for the southern hemisphere. And on the right side, a new representation of the planet, which is no more this 5 Clive zone, it's just a terraqueous globe as we know it now. One of the first publications for sure, 1526 by Appianus. We are looking if there are other ideas also earlier. And so this is the line of interpretation. And then so the question is then, when were they spreading? Which kind of knowledge was created and when were they spreading? So we have a look now the geographic and temporal distribution of these tables, and I can tell you, so the most published table is still the 7 climbs. So they're now the highest number of reoccurrences. So from this perspective, you can say, okay, traditional knowledge won. In spite of Copernicus, in spite of journeys of exploration. So here, sorry, I didn't start it. This is a visualization that we created that if you see the lines also moves at different speeds because we also want to analyze not just the geographic distribution and the general temporal distribution, but also the speed of circulation. Convinced that the speed is also an important parameter to figure out whether knowledge is successful or not, or is playing an important role. So these are is a very high dynamic. As I said, the highest number of reoccurrences of this table. This table has the highest number of reoccurrences. It moves all over Europe, as you see, and but it stops about the end of the century. This is the 7 climbs. About the end of the 16th century, there is basically nothing left. Now, if we look, I go further just to save time. If we look at the 9 climbs table, you see that this, the icebreaker comes a little bit later. It comes from Leipzig. It's no surprise. The movement is very slow, apart from some episodes, and has I can anticipate before you see it, has a diffusion that basically remains in Northern Europe. It doesn't have, so this idea of the 9 climb zones was, yeah, well, okay. You see, if it comes from the east of Germany, Wittenberg obviously there too, then it's typically taken over also in Frankfurt in the time, and typically in Paris, which was very receptive for textbooks and science from Wittenberg and from the Protestant Reformation. But you see, in comparison to the other days, the diffusion, the spread of this solution is not even comparable. Now we would expect the great success of the 24 client tables. It has less occurrences, as I already said, but indeed, the important thing, it spreads over highest number of cities. So it's received and taken over by more printers, publishers, which then implies by more universities, local universities, and the teaching. So the speed of spread is also much higher because of this higher geographic distribution. And it continues after the end of the century. So this is the difference. And you see, it covers Europe very well, but it's just less occurrences. So yeah, thanks. So we could, so to speak, stop here, but I don't, because I still have 7 hours. It's not the reason, but the point is that no, we wouldn't be, if I had to stop here, so we wouldn't have the total analysis. The total analysis is speaking about also some epistemological issues. We wouldn't come from department 1 if we weren't doing that. And so to give you an example, so we moved to a little bit further statistical, sorry, the next is I save, statistical analysis that we have made. So we calculated the kernel density estimation for the reappearances of reoccurrences, geotemporal reoccurrences of these tables. On the left top, you see the book production again, because this is data needed to normalize our estimations. And then you see the occurrences and the plots of the 7, 9, and 24 client tables, and you see that the 24 and the 7 climbs, they they go up toward the end of the century, then the 7 disappears and the 24th continues. So as I said, the number of reoccurrences is there. So it's difficult to say how these innovations, 9 climbs, 24 climbs, actually were really successful or not. The 9 climbs is clearly not. The 24, it's difficult to state this. But the point, so if you look then exactly at you go back to the historical sources, you figure out that the success of the 24 climbs table, which is toward the end of the century, is actually related to the fact that this table was published always in this period when it was successful, always together with the 7 climbs table. So which means that to make an innovation successful in this case, it was important to remain close to the tradition as much as possible. You couldn't avoid that. There was a reception for that. And this, so it's obviously, it's tempting to generalize. Scientific knowledge end of 16th century has to be related to the tradition, otherwise you can't introduce any innovation. But it's just tempting to generalize this, but this is a case study that shows, at least in this case, this was the way knowledge was spreading related to tradition. Thank you so much. So, and this is all the people in the background of this work. Thank you.
One question directly, and then we will move on. Is there one?
So.
Fine. Thank you, Matteo.
Okay, I'll take my stuff your way.
See you. Everybody, please come to the front for.
Oh.
It is now in front of the building. In front of the building at the chair, not chairs, stairs.
Professor Chen, we'll be back online in about 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay.
And okay. Okay, Professor Chen, we're back. We will start in a couple minutes.
Okay.
So we will continue with our next session. Dr. Chen Wei, you are there. I see you present and alert already, and that PowerPoints are ready. Please go ahead for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction. Guten Tag, dear colleagues. I'm so honored to have the opportunity to speak at this conference, and many thanks for the organizer of this conference to allow us to attend this meeting via the online form. Many thanks. Some word to say before my formal speech. From 2020, the year of 2020 until last year, I was quite pleased to assist Professor Zhang Baichuan and Professor Tian Miao in organizing a reading group on the evolution of knowledge within our institute. I believe that this book will have a profound impact on the study of the history of science and technology. So like Professor Liu Yu the day before, Liu Yu did the day before, I would like to extend a belated birthday greeting to Professor Jürgen Rehn. Happy birthday. Now let's turn to the subject under discussion. What I'm concerned with is the similarity and the differences between the knowledge or attitude of people to the world in the pre-modern periods through communication networks such as the Silk Road. The Silk Road is just one name of the network, or the Porcelain Road, the Spicy Road, the Amber Road, etc., according to the substances of greatest interest, flowing through the network, just as Professor Peter Frankopan showed in his book. And the processes of diffusion or exclusion, that these similarities or differences demonstrated. In fact, the previous topic I submitted about 2 years ago was about the travel medicine traveling along the Silk Road, but unfortunately, up to now, I think I had difficulty in finding sufficient evidence that such knowledge had traveled from the West Asia to pre-modern China. So I had to shift my topic to the present topic. It has a smaller focus, but I'm more certain that it has traveled or spread between East and West. What I'm talking about is creation and the transmission of myths of magical characters surrounding the ostrich. a bird with immense size. This says it will eat the lower quality iron put in front of it and excrete much purer, sharper steel. I think this may not be new to Western scholars, as the famous the great writer Shakespeare referred it in the Henry VI. The ostrich is also often associated with horseshoes and other symbols associated with blacksmiths in the images. Of course, the ostrich is intriguing enough in its own right. Live ostrich feathers or eggshells products became the materials that moved across the ancient cultures. The ostrich originated only in the desert and savanna zones of places such as East Africa, Southeast Africa, and North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. Also, given the extensive entrepot trade that existed, the ostrich didn't only move directly between its place of origin and its final destination. It's transferred in a variety of different trade forms, tributes, bounties, and commodities, etc. As with other goods that move long distances in small quantities, but in more valuable terms. For example, precious stones. The ostrich characteristics were touted and constantly given new attributes. This has turned the myth about it into an increasingly large collection of ideas. Over the past century, many scholars have become interested in the information about the amazing ostrich diet in different cultures. But there is a lack of access to and analysis of Chinese historical sources. However, the differences in cultural tradition reflected in the ostrich's diet have to be based on a detailed comparison of the accounts of different cultural contexts. Understandably, the Near East and the Mediterranean coast closer to the ostrich place of origin had greater access to the ostrich. Many ancient Greek and Roman authors referred to the bird, this kind of bird. Aristotle and Pliny the Elder describe the ostrich form and habits in even great details. Among many features, Pliny the Elder noted in particularly that they can digest any substance without distinction, which could be compared to the folly shown by ostriches bury their heads in the bushes when they encounter enemies. The latter is still a very common misconception up to now. Like many other species of birds, ostriches need to swallow small stones in order to help grind up their food. Since the ostrich eat a lot of stones, it's likely to eat other hard objects as well. It's not surprising that such an idea should arise. Just about the same time as Pliny the Elder, or a little later, the Tosefta, a Jewish Torah text from the Hebrew Tannaim period, mentioned Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel as saying that one may even move glass shard because they are food for ostriches. The use of glass flakes as ostrich feed implies that this specific knowledge was not so old at that time, because glass was still quite precious within the Jewish Jewish community before the invention of glass blowing in the 4th century BC. So it's unlikely that sufficient pieces of glass to feed domestic ostrich would have appeared earlier than this. During this period, another source also endows birds such as the ostrich with special functions. That's alchemy. In Hellenistic Egypt, a number of alchemical texts refer to the feeding of old or counterfeit pears to birds, which could excrete refurbished or genuine pears. This was both a transition in food and a shift in the ostrich from being a farmed fowl in the just like the hens and ducks in the as a kind of silent whales to a domestic animal as a tool for production and cooperation with humans. So what was the situation in China in the parallel period? The Book of Han, which recorded the history of the Western Han dynasty about the same time with the Republic of Roman, mentioned that the state of Anxi, Anxi equals Persian Patia, the Persian dynasty, as Anxi having a great house, Jue. The word for Jue in Chinese character at that time, it's just same as another Chinese character, Que. The meaning of it is the bird. And in a 5th century commentary, it was said that a great horse Jue ate barley. As from the comparison, we can find that whether eating stones, broken glasses, or barley, the description of the ostrich's diet was still largely realistic. However, it was not long before the story began to change gradually. With the spread of Christianity, fables based on biblical ideas about the character of the animal emerged. The physiologus, which was formed in about the 2nd to the 4th century AD, provide knowledge and anecdotal lore about many animals, actual or imaginary, including among the animals, including the ostrich. The book was gradually developed over a very long period of time, and in what appear in Byzantine times concerns the ostrich diet. And it says that it is whatever it finds is, even with its blacksmith, is devouring red hot iron, passing it immediately through its intestines, from which it emerges still glowing. The iron, however, is lightened and purified through the process of digestion, as I saw with my own eye in shells. Here we encounter the myth of the ostrich diet. Physiologus and the animal fables from which they were derived had a very huge impact on medieval conception of animals and symbolist arts. For medieval people, the didactics and animal knowledge in the physiologus were confused and inseparable. And the knowledge and legend of the ostrich were mixed and dispersed everywhere with it. It's likely that it has been in circulation for some time before the 7th and 8th century. What do Chinese histories of this period tell us so we can compare between the West and East for the second time? The Book of Wei, which records the history of Chinese Northern Wei dynasty about mainly during the 4th and the 5th and the first half of the 5th century, said that ostriches eat grass and meat and can also swallow fire. In the mid of the 7th century, an ambassador from the nowadays the northern Afghanistan offered a very large bird like a camel, which ate copper and iron. The empire of the Tang Dynasty sent it to the ritual in Zhaoling tomb. The Zhaoling tomb is father. It is a tomb of father of the empire. It was possible that the ostrich that appeared as a ritual was driven to perform a swallowing of metal. We see that in the 6th to the 7th century, the Chinese were successively informed that the ostriches could eat fire or iron. It's likely that this was also the impression that Persians and Central Asians had of the ostrich food habits at that time. These two aspects seem to have been separated, unlike the animal fables that bring them together. At this time, the myth of Ostrich Diet is still festering in West Eurasia. Two events accompany the popularity of physiologists. The first was the collapse of the Western European economies after the 6th century and the general lack of large-scale iron making industry in Western Eurasia. Secondly, the rise of alchemy, just mentioned before. Based on the theory of the transformation of matter, the idea that precious substances could be transformed from the cheaper ones by means of specific formulas and the methods of manipulation became well known. The ostrich's ability to cast the unknown iron was also a special kind of alchemy. The craft or arts of alchemy has been validated by a large number of alchemists, and ostrich feeding is no exception. Most of these verifications quoted from secondary sources are not all chemistries were competent to actually engage in the matter. Al-Jahis in his Kitab al-Hayawan and al-Biruni in the 11th century in his Kitab al-Jamahiri both cited the verification made by others, and Albertus Magnus performed the German philosopher performed the verification himself. Al-Biruni's narration deserves our special attention. He begins by quoting a relevant verse from the poem Al-Hudari, a contemporary of the Prophet Muhammad, to show that Arabics knew that birds could play a role in the refining of iron as early as the beginning of Islam. He also said, as for the belly or inert of a famished bird, iron have been cut. It's heated like the cinders and places before the ostrich so that all the dirt is removed and goes to the belly of the bird. And the iron becomes clear and worthy of being made into a blade. It's then pounded and polished with a furbishing instrument. Those who have seen the sight say that ostrich globs up the hot iron, but immediately defecated it. And the next paragraph is we skip. Several points are worth noting in this passage. Firstly, the ostrich can complete the digestive process so quickly that it can excrete the feces immediately. Secondly, the birds can be starved for a few days before feeding to increase the incentive to eat iron, and also to improve the effect of iron refining with multiple repetitions through the bird's digestive tract. Thirdly, in addition to ostrich, ducks and other birds have the same ability. This implies another transition of the main body of the relevant legend in Eastern Europeans, who has less Eastern European, just like the Slavs and Russes, who had less opportunity to see ostriches. By this time, a solid trade route had developed between Western Asia and Northern Europe. The Slavs' knowledge of avian steelmaking was also shared by the North. And in the North legend, Theodoric saga, written in the 12th to 13th century, the legendary master swordsmith Wieland made swords on 3 separate occasions, then filled them into scrapes, mixed them with food and fed them to hungry foes for 3 days, and the swords made from the iron expelled from each foe became better and better. Here we can see many similar elements mentioned earlier. The cutting of the iron blocks or refined swords into crumbs, the fasting of the birds before feeding them, and the fact that the repetition of the feeding, fetching, and the refining process can result in a product of better quality and other similar and others. In medieval Europe, the ostrich was often depicted with fiery red color around its body, and from the 12th century onwards, it was often associated with blacksmiths, horseshoes, nails, keys, and chains, just as I mentioned in the start of this speech. A tradition that continued into the Renaissance period. And the 16th century Italian metallurgist Vanocchio Birincocchio recorded that Damascus, the people in the Damascus also used this method to make good steel. In fact, the repetition of the bird's digestive tract to improve the results of iron making is similar to the ancient Chinese method of folding and forging iron and steel several times to make 100 times refined steel. Records of ostriches swallow iron to make a better quality iron or steel could also be found in Chinese literature. A later work attributed to the 11th century famous writer Su Shi, or Mr. Dongpo. The book name is a book of interaction between species by Mr. Dongpo. It was a book about the interaction between nature and human behaviors. It says that outside the Western nations, where there is said to be a bird like a large dark colored goose, tall and huge in size, is fed broken iron, shaving, and flour connected together with water, and the down is taken to refine and forge iron, which is 10 times sharper than ordinary iron. This account again shows elements similar to those recorded in the Al-Biruni and other documents in the Western Eurasia. The feeding of ostriches with a mixture of iron fillings and flour, and the use of ostrich down as a raw material for making good steel or iron. But the author doesn't state whether the operation had to be repeated in order to obtain a product 10 times sharper than normal iron. This account still stated that the ostrich originated in West Asia and that it was not integrated into the Chinese social and cultural context. This exotism is not eliminated in other Chinese works that transmit this knowledge. These are the evolution of the ostrich diet myth and its parallel in the Eastern and Western literatures of the similar period. However, there is much more to be explored. In the framework of alchemy, the avian digestive tract became the means of material purification. And after this thinking was formed, a particular bird species, such as ostrich, duck, goose, pigeon, hawk. And the object and the substance can be purified, or both elements that could be replaced. For example, iron can be replaced with pearls and rubies, as is well documented in text from the later classical Egypt, Islam, medieval Western Europe, and ancient Chinese alchemy and geomology books. And in Tang Dynasty Chinese notebook novels, where dogs could eat golden sand, while their owner obtained large quantities of gold by penning dug down. Dogs also exerted the ability to refine and enrich themselves in precious metals. However, the use of the even digestive tract for metal smelting and refining has always been less documented in Chinese literature than in the West. And in most of the most closely related accounts, the Chinese texts still speak of a hearsay from outside the region. This means that the myth of the Ostrich Diet is obstructed in its localization in China. It's most likely due to the superiority of pre-modern China over other cultures in terms of iron smelting skills and the scale of this artisan. The greatest expansion of the digestive function of birds, such as ostriches in Western Eurasia, didn't exist in China. Remember the aforementioned use of bird to purify pearls during the Song Dynasty and the Mongolian period, 10th to the 14th century. Many daily encyclopedias appear in China, which also mention the use of birds to purify pearls. But they are equally inarticulate and lacking in practicality. This is also related to the shift towards everyday alchemy in Chinese craftsmanship. From the Song Dynasty onward, under the influence of the literary taste for elegance, a hobby for antiquities emerged in China, and there was a wider demand for old bronze, jade, and wooden objects than for making false or new gold, silver, or jewelry. The choice of the old over the new also squeezed the space for birds to carry the social imagination. However, another aspect of the Chinese literature is richer in ideas. That's the relationship between animals as a source of medicine and the human body. After the Tang Dynasty, animal feces, including birds, were more often used as medicine, most likely influenced by the Indian Ayurvedic medicine that spread with Buddhism. In Indian yogic practice, imitating animal postures such as the peacock, the goose, and the swan, was thought to bring about different effects. The body of the bird become a metaphor for the human body, and the vessel for alchemy is transferred into a vessel for prana or life force. This is more often seen in Tibetan tantric practice, which are more influenced by India, while in China, where after the Song Dynasty, the internal alchemy of immortality gradually replaced the previously prevalent yellow and white. Yellow equals gold and white equals silver alchemy, aimed at acquire the precious metal. The human body itself is a vehicle for the refinement of the physical body without the need for eternal objects. This means that there was no room for eternal things, including the animals such as ostrich. to be heard from outside the county, and to enter further into the Chinese alchemical system. Instead, as a contract, European alchemists who continue the idea of material transformation has the opportunity to gradually move towards a modern understanding of digestion by establishing some explanatory systems such as inner alchemist of living being. To conclude, I would like to summarize the encounter of the myth of the Ostrich Diet in different cultures on 3 dimensions. Firstly, as a material things, the ostrich striking appearance makes it vulnerable to the spotlight of exotic species, which has a selective and amplifying effect on existing ostrich knowledge. Attached to important attributes and specific shapes, legend about the ostrich peculiar eating habits were selected and not infrequently exaggeratedly layered on the top of the ostrich materiality. Secondly, the legend of ostrich predation is a narrative of gradual change as established idea interacts with new culture and context. Its prevalence in multiple cultures attracts attention mostly from alchemists or artisans such as ironsmiths or goldsmiths. This suggests a common tendency to project a focus on culture psychology from social economic factors such as a lack of large-scale ironmaking in many places. The legend of ostrich predation is a narrative of gradual change as established idea interacts with new culture and context. Its prevalence in multiple cultures attracts attention mostly from alchemists or artisans of ironmaking. This suggests a common tendency to project a focus on culture psychology from social economy factors such as lack. Although the myth of the ostrich diet has spread through China for several centuries, the relatively advanced iron refining technology of pre-modern China didn't have the social economic drive to build the myth of the ostrich making iron. As a result, it's only sporadically documented in Chinese. Thirdly, the space in which the ostrich legend was created, transmitted, and transmuted came from pre-logical notion of material transformation and the induction of things in the pre-scientific cognition. The idea of using the digestive functions of animal to transform cheap objects into precious ones reflected a confusion between the physiological function of the body and the process of material transformation. This concept is also widespread, but has deeper roots in the alchemy of Western Eurasia. The myth of the ostrich diet was based on this common belief, and its verification challenged it. In the late Middle Ages, scholars explored digestive function, and as alchemy evolved into modern chemistry, the myth of the ostrich swallowing and refining metal was finally explored empirically. Okay, that's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. One question, I am interpreting a flexible adaptation of time schedules to our changed arrangements. So one question we could feed in, then we will proceed, then we have a coffee break. I don't see one. So thank you for the presentation, Dr. Cheng Wei. Again, you stay online and follow the discussion. Maybe we have in the podium later on some questions related to your talks. Thank you again. So,
thank you.
I'm happy to welcome the next speaker. As everybody in this room, we know each other since a very long time, but I don't disclose how long. I'm very happy that Kostas Gavroglo had time to come and share his thoughts with us in classical presentation mode, I heard. So we will hear him live speaking. Thank you.
Fine. Thank you. Thank you, Gerd. I'm truly thankful to the organizers and especially to Stefano Ruffo for inviting me to this meeting. And I'm really sorry to have messed up the program because of airline problems. If Gerd didn't want to disclose how many years ago, I will do it since it is almost to the day in 1992, 30 years ago, that I first met Jürgen. It was after the instigation of Bob Cohen, a friend of ours and a very important figure in the history and philosophy of science, who said, why don't you go to meet this young guy who is one of the editors of the Einstein papers? So I duly went to the offices, and Robert Schulman was there, the same office. They welcomed me in a very peculiar way. The reason was that the previous day, the book on the love letters between Einstein and Mileva was published, and they had a very unjust criticism from one of our conservative colleagues from the other side of the river at Harvard. So we started talking with Jürgen. He tried to explain to me some problems of the manifold near the black holes. I thought I had enough mathematics to understand. I lost him halfway through, left. You wouldn't say that this was the beginning of a very promising friendship, but peculiarly enough, it was. I think there are two things that I want to underline about Jürgen. One is the very important initiative of the Berlin Declaration on Open Access to the sciences and the humanities. Jürgen was an important initiator of this Berlin Declaration. Gerd, of course, knows also a lot about the details, but I think it was the beginning of a very promising thing. And the second thing is Jürgen's and Max Planck Institute's very conscious effort to support colleagues from developing communities of historians of science. And I think this we should underline, especially we in Greece are particularly thankful, but it is not only for Greece, and it is this internationalization that is even today, after the beginning of the Ukraine war, under so much threat. And it is an example of how we should do our everyday work apart from our scholarly work. Now, I will follow Jürgen, but only in a formal way, because he always, we were always discussing that meetings of that sort are very good opportunities to explore some unfinished projects rather than, you know, present things that we have already published. So I will trouble you with this issue of what Galileo discussed with Urban during those 6 long meetings. Now, between the end of April in 1624 and beginning of June, Galileo, in his own words, had 6 long meetings with Pope Urban. We know nothing about what they discussed. The only things we know is that at the end of the 6 meetings, Galileo was given a painting, 2 medals, some Agnus Dei, some letters to bring to the Medicis of how great Galileo was. But what did they discuss there during those meetings? There are assumptions, and everyone, not everyone, most of the historians ignore these meetings. Those who do not ignore these meetings assume that what happened in those meetings was that Galileo asked Urban to take back the 1616 injunction, which was not against Galileo. It was about the assessment of the commission about Copernicus's ideas, and that he was given the go-ahead to write a book as long as the Copernicus's ideas would be hypothetical. Now, if you think about it, you don't need 6 long meetings for those 2 things, okay? Even if they were true, even if they discussed those things. Why? Because first of all, no pope would take back what happened in 1616, because what happened in 1616 was legally okay. By 1624, things had changed in very serious manners, and therefore to bring again the 1616 incidents would have started a whole new problem. And Urban's views concerning the hypothetical character of the Copernican ideas were well known because he believed very much in this idea of God's omnipotence, that it was impossible for humans to understand the way God created things, okay? Because God could have created things differently, and we get perhaps the same results as what we think things are like, okay? So if you deal with those things hypothetically, you wouldn't get into all kinds of troubles. What about if we assume that what happened during these meetings was that Urban asked Galileo to write a book where the Aristotelian philosopher would be the one who, as the book unfolded, this Aristotelian philosopher will be convinced by the arguments of the mathematician. The philosopher in this proposed work would be neither a passive listener nor a straw man to be bashed about, nor someone whose counter-arguments would be too weak to merit serious discussion. Though in the beginning of the book, it would be the astronomer who will be providing the evidence and the arguments in support of Copernicus's idea, the philosopher would be rather reserved in fully accepting them. As the book progressed, it would be the philosopher who would become the hegemonic figure, embellishing and overindulging the new state of the cosmos. By the end of the book, there would emerge a philosopher with a different profile than the one he had at the beginning of the book. This, in effect, could have been a new social and political agenda that Urban wished to advance in order to hold back the Lynchians and Galileo's agenda of marginalizing the Aristotelians. So what about if Urban asked Galileo write this book where there will be conciliation between those two, in effect, social groups. Okay. As I'd like to argue, I don't know if I'll be very convincing because of time lag, such an assumption is not against any of the evidence, and also it gives us perhaps a better understanding of some issues that have not been fully resolved in the bibliography. Now, at the crux of the problem is the assayer. The assayer was an answer that Galileo wrote against what Grassi, a very important Jesuit, supported concerning the comets that had appeared in 1618. Okay, there was, you know, back and forth, some leaflets, doesn't matter. The end product of all this was the assayer, and everyone agrees that it was the Manifesto of the Lynchians. The assayer was written by Galileo as a long letter to Cesarini, a fellow and very important Lynchian. It was given to the rest of the group, and they wrote a lot of things, they took out a lot of things. So in a way, it was a collective work. It was almost ready to be published when in August 1623, Barberini becomes the new Pope Urban. So they change I'm sorry. They change gear, and they dedicate it to Urban. And it is our book that we dedicated to you. This was presented to Urban a month after he took office, because he was elected at the beginning of August, but took office at the end of September because of some health problems Urban had. And 23 of October, they present in a very lavish ceremony. And it is on record by his secretary of briefs, as it were, Ciampoli, that when Urban was having meals, he enjoyed listening to Ciampoli reading some of passages from the book itself. Now, when Galileo met the Pope at the end of April until June, that was 6 months later, the assumption goes that Matteo Barberini became aware of the political role of the papacy. It's one thing to be the Cardinal Matteo Barberini, it's a different ball game to be the Pope Urban VIII. And the exigencies of the office itself tells you that you should not enjoy the assayer. The assayer is a dangerous thing. It's a dangerous thing because it creates problems about a very important group, which are the Aristotelians, and gives credit about another group whose obedience to the church or to tradition is under question. And Urban puts down an agenda to try to conciliate those things, to try to ask Galileo to be the catalytic force to bring about some peace in this new papacy, which started under the best of conditions and ended under the worst conditions, of course. Okay? So if the assumption is what we assume to be, or any variation of this, that kind of an agenda needed a lot of meetings to iron it out. Because, as I said, if you ask the Pope to take back the 1616 injunction, you are very naive. And we know if Galileo was anything but naive, okay? If you ask him to write a book, the permission to write a book, well, you know what the Pope would say, as long as it is hypothetical treatment of the Copernican ideas, which gives you a lot of leeway, by the way, to do a lot of things. So perhaps it is interesting to try to force ourselves to read the Assayer as an epistemological discourse, which, however, hides a social and political agenda. And manifestos usually are like this. You talk about one thing, but the underlying discourse, the underlying message, perhaps is another thing, okay? And we know that the Lynchians were no friends of the Aristotelians, okay? And we know that they were very aggressive against the Aristotelians. Interestingly, if you just go through some, really classic works, they consider the Assayer an extreme case of rhetoric and polemic. Santillana, for example, says that the book was promptly and unanimously recognized for what it was, the masterpiece of Italian polemic prose, nailing the enemy to the post, sparkling wit and destructive irony. Stillman Drake considers it as the greatest polemic ever written in the history of science. William Shee argued that the Assayer is a masterpiece of style, a model of devastating irony. Pietro Redondi noted that it made a remarkable impact because its irony, its murderous wordplay, the poetry of its allegories, and its boundless intellectual passion, it delighted the humanists and the rhetoricians. I'm sorry. So, Anne and Anne with Heilbronn, Biagioli and everyone. So here we have the following. We have a text. The Pope was not, it was recorded as liking it at first hearing it. And yet, when you start thinking the office you are holding, you realize that you should not like texts like this. It is not politically expedient to like texts like this. So he has this new agenda and tries to impose it on Galileo. I'm truly sorry. I had a pharyngitis. So if one attempts, I do have some water, I'm fine, thank you. If you attempt such a reading of the Assayer, such a reading, a political reading in a way of the Assayer, then I think you could at least find some better, in quotation mark, explanations about some issues. So if our assumption does not come into any conflict with existing evidence and gives us some further insight about some question marks, perhaps it's not a bad thing. What are these issues? One, Federico Cesi was the founder, funder, and main force behind the Lynchian Academy. a very intriguing figure, a figure that was very extremely close to Galileo at that time. Then there were some problems. Galileo writes 2 letters to Cesi while he's in Rome. One at the middle of their meetings in May, and the other one just before he left. In both meetings, in both letters, you see a very disappointed Galileo. I don't think this has been commented upon by scholars. This is a Galileo who wants to get out of Rome. He wants to go back to Florence. You are given the privilege of meeting the Pope so many times. You came to Rome with this ebullience, and then you want to escape and go back to Florence without saying why? Because he came to Rome, perhaps wishing to get this consensus from Urban, and he was faced with something totally unexpected. Otherwise, how can you explain this emotion, this sentiment in those 2 letters? Secondly, delaying the finishing of the dialogue. After he left Rome in 1624, the dialogue was almost ready because he had written the Discourse on Tides, and he also wrote the answer to Ingoli in the summer of 24. And we know that in the dialogue, there are word for word various passages from those 2 works. So he waits 6 years to finish the dialogue. The main story is that he was ill. First of all, he was not ill during the 6 years. And secondly, he did a lot of work in engineering and physics during this 6 years. I'm putting you in a... No. So, how can you explain with our assumption this delay? Perhaps the only way you can explain it is that he wanted to stall. He wanted to buy time until Urban had some problems. And after 1628, and especially after 1629, we know that Urban had all kinds of problems. He was in a very tight situation as time went on. So we have this letter where he says, now I start finishing the book. Now the book we know is 900-page manuscript. You don't finish it in one go. And yet by January, February of 1930, the book was finished. Okay, so perhaps he waited for the right time to finish the book when Urban would not be so much preoccupied, with how hypothetical things are, or whether, the philosopher is being bashed or whatever. In other words, he may have wished that Urban's troubles would move away his emphasis on the discussion they had 6 years ago. Now, third, we all know that there was an utter confusion with the permission to print the dialogue, okay? The dialogue has 3 imprimaturs. It has Riccardi's with no date, and then there is the archbishops of Florence and the inquisitors of Florence. But if you look at the details, it's utter confusion when printing a book or getting a permission is a rather straightforward procedure, okay? It's not a very complicated procedure. So one is not sure who actually read carefully the book. One is not sure why there are objections. There are a lot of details to this, but it all comes down to the fact that most probably neither Riccardi, who was the person responsible to giving the imprimaturs, nor Ciampoli had clear directions from the Pope. Did the Pope disclose to them what he discussed with Galileo in 1624? It would have been a little tricky, because if Galileo did not deliver, that would be something very serious. The Pope asked someone to do something, and that someone didn't deliver. Okay? You don't get away with those things. So if the Pope was not sure that Galileo actually delivered, he wouldn't have disclosed all the details of the 1624 discussions unless he was sure what the book was about. So this incredible confusion, and there are all kinds of details, perhaps can be further clarified with this assumption. Last, there is this figure, Niccolini, who is the Tuscan ambassador to Rome, very friendly, Francesco Niccolini, very friendly to Galileo, and he has this correspondence with his boss, who is the Tuscan Secretary of Foreign Affairs, as it were. There are many things to discuss here, but there is one thing which has not been actually given the attention it deserves in the bibliography. In one of the letters, Niccolini says that he was granted an audience by the Pope, and in that meeting, the Pope told him, and now I quote, about this matter, but with the explicit order not to reveal these things even to His Highness, to the Medicis, under penalty of censure. Although I, Niccolini, begged the Pope to be able to report them at least to His Highness only, he answered that I should be glad to have known them from him in confidence and as a friend and not as a minister. I mean, what was so important, so mysterious? It couldn't have been the new document they found, because a week earlier, Riccardi had already informed Niccolini that they found that document, okay? It couldn't have been anything else unless there was the issue of the Eucharist, which was a very serious issue, of course, or the fact that, listen, Niccolini, I told Galileo in 1624 to write a book along those lines, and now he comes 60 years later, does not obey me, and he writes something completely different. That I cannot take. And I don't think there is a third alternative. Now, does this bring us any closer to the truth of what actually happened? I mean, we are all historians here, and we know that this is a very naive question. I think it's a story that could have happened, and as all stories in the history of science, it's, I think, an enjoyable thing to see where it leads us. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry about my cough.
Thank you, Kostas. We thought we have a little, not only coffee break, but also a recovery break for your voice. And then you also can collect some ideas and questions, and we will resume with a question to Kostas after the coffee. People are waiting outside. A quarter of an hour break. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, it's hard.
Then I try to catch yours.
Yeah.
Also say.
Exactly. It's here.
Is that? Yes, he doesn't know yet. So
Yeah. Tell me.
Comes in. As soon as Jürgen comes in, we will start. And there is a prolongation of the discussion of the previous session, a few questions about Galileo's story. And then we have the session. We will finish a little bit later, but I hope it will be time for lunch. It's here.
So I thought we have a leftover for the discussion. Jürgen is in an urgent mission and he will come rather soon back for discussion. So the overlap discussion of Kostas' thesis we will orchestrate in the following way, and then we will continue with Sonja Brentjes' presentation. First, I asked Rivka to have her statement because it's a big statement and thesis by Kostas, and we shouldn't leave the opportunity unused to have some words of opinion and discussion. So Rivka with the first statement, as soon as Jürgen is back, I always admire his ability to jump in a completely new context without knowing what is going on and give statements just to the point and with full reflection. So I'm absolutely convinced he will give also his opinion. He knows the situation, the cases. There Jürgen is. Jürgen, I need you. So we have a short statement, discussion of statements of Kostas' thesis. I asked Rivka first to have an opinion, and then I ask you to have also a second opinion on it, and then Kostas will reply. And so we have a first round of reflections on the thesis.
Okay. So first I would like to thank Kostas for drawing our attention to the very important point about the interim time that elapsed between 24 and the discussions with the Pope and 30 when the book was finally published. So I think we really know too little about that, and it will add a lot of information if we research it in a more thorough way. Now, the thing that I would like to draw Kostas' attention to, of course he knows it, but I want to repeat it. In my research of Galileo, I put a lot of emphasis on the complexity of the position of the state, the position of the Aristotelians, and the position of the scientists. So the most important is that the church could not come into agreement what is the right position, whether you are allowed to discuss hypothetically things, and these were mostly the Jesuits, or whether you need scientia, and then you cannot allow this. And the Dominicans, many of them, or most of them, I think, took this position. Now, among the Aristotelians as well, there was no agreement, and so there was no agreement between the scientists. So my conclusion from this situation is that we have somehow to pay attention to all these parameters together, the complexity of the situation, the inability to reduce this story into simplistic kind of narrative, and this gives us still a lot of space of research of these issues. Thank you very much.
So first of all, Kostas, thank you. Of course, there are different ways of dealing with complexity. One way is the famous cutting the Gordian knot. That may have been exactly what you have been doing. I was, really admiring how you master this complex material. It was like a, piano concert, as we heard before. The letter from Nicoli here and Riccardi there, and so very impressive how deeply run. My immediate reaction to this was, you have been a minister of science, education, and religion in the Greek government, and so I think it has enriched your perspective as a historian of science as well. So you could identify easily with the Pope. Others perhaps could more identify with Galileo. Elio Nenci reminded us of Ludovico Gemonat's identification with Galileo and the Communist Party as the church and so on. But you could clearly identify with Urban VIII, and that would have been a very clever move. So you might have just been, that is sort of my only question mark. You might have just been more clever than Urban VIII. If Urban VIII had been so clever as you, that would be perfectly plausible as a story. But he might just not have been that clever. But that's my comment.
Thank you. For someone who has worked on 19th and 20th century history of physics and chemistry, it's not very polite to go into the 17th century, but thankfully Rivka has been very generous. I absolutely agree with you. And I think in order, again, to understand the assumption that I make in a deeper way, I think one should understand Pope's difficulty in dealing with the differences within the church, okay? And therefore, he takes a political position. The political position is don't do anything which will create a social strife between these two groups. Otherwise, you are absolutely right, and I have a lot of details along those lines as well. Look, I don't know if my wife Eleni told you so, but when I told her what I'm doing, she said, obviously after the ministry, that's the only thing you could do, understand how people think in those positions. But I was discussing it with Gerd. I think it's intriguing to see how Cardinal Matteo Barberini becomes conscious of the fact that now he's the Pope Urban VIII. And it's one thing to be Cardinal Matteo Barberini and do all the things you're doing, and it's another thing to be the Pope. And therefore, you have to obey the exigencies, the political exigencies of the office itself. Okay? So I don't know what would have happened if I was Urban VIII. Okay, that I cannot answer. Perhaps, 30 years down the road, we may be able to have that discussion. Okay. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody. Now, without much ado, we go to Sonja Brentjes' presentation. I asked her, she doesn't feel completely well, so if she needs to sit down, that she should take the chair, the seat of the chair to present it like that. And we will operate, and maybe you can operate also the PowerPoint for her.
So how do I run then the PowerPoint?
You can tell him next and back.
Slide and I can change it for you, or you can use this.
No, that's too much. I need to run my own.
Maybe just tell him next or
No,
back.
I need my.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh. It's working. No. Do you hear me? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Good. Thank you very much for allowing me to sit. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm taking you to a different part of the world, somewhat outside of history, into historiography, because I thought there is no time really to take you into a culture that is not that familiar for you, into a specific case. And I rather opted for giving you a very quick run through the different positions since the last 50 years in history of science and Islamicate societies and its neighboring fields, like different types of history of specific societies, what people have proposed and thought about what Jochen termed spread of knowledge, which of course was termed differently. And I hope that will be interesting to you too. So what I call here previous history is basically the history of the 20th century, despite the fact that in some groups, these points are still very much in the center of the debate. So in the 20th century, between, let's say, 1970, as far as I can see that, and 2000, there were two main points of interest with regard to spread of knowledge in Islamicate societies. These two main points of interest were translation and reception. Translation internally in Islamicate societies, Greek, or can you do the next one? I'm sorry.
You just tell us next or back slide.
All right. Within Islamicate society, center is Baghdad, time is second half 8th century to the early 10th century. It's basically, the focus was on translations of Greek texts into Arabic and or Syriac. From the outside perspective, the Islamicate societies were very much involved. It's Arabic into Latin, and a little later Arabic into Hebrew. So that's a basic field of studies with regard to translations. With regard to reception, there basically was the question, who is participating in which position in the translations? And there was a kind of debate, who is active and who is passive. Yeah, this is already inscribed in the word of reception. And actually in the field, there was not a very strong debate in difference to some of the historical disciplines. Just for entertainment purposes, here you have two copies of two Greco-Arabic translations. On the right, I'm sorry, the next one. On the right, Hero's Mechanics, translated in the middle of the 9th century. And on the left, within a book of the Arithmetic of Diophantos, actually translated by the same guy like the Hero Mechanics, also in the middle of the 9th century. These positions, in my view, which is rather recent, my view, I mean, had 5 main shortcomings from a historiographical position. First, and that's still the case in Greco-Arabica, a neglect of the occult sciences. So an important part of the transmission of science, of spread of knowledge, was just pushed to the boundaries or not at all looked at. It's changing now a little bit through an ERC project on Syriac and Arabic translations of Greek texts. The historiographical position, which I by now really regret very much, is that there was a very strong position saying we should not study translations in the sciences in connection with other translations. Translating scientific text is something completely different. So let's stick with science, let's forget about religion, let's forget about diplomacy and any other literature, for instance. The parallel to this position was that there was very limited attention paid to issues of textual analysis. And I only name two examples. We were very trusting in historical claims, meaning in claims made in historical sources. Even in the case, which seems to be very simple, Arabic translations of Euclid's Elements, we simply took at face value for a very long time what manuscripts and historical narratives told us. And at least I have learned that we should not do that. And there was a strong disregard for context, which, of course, as we all know by now, is highly problematic. The result of this kind of shortcomings was what today I consider the creation of a myth. This myth is the myth of the translation movement. This term comes from the 1930s, from, let's say, Arabists primarily in Great Britain. So far, I don't understand why they fell in love with this category of the social sciences. What happened, they never defined what movement in a social sense is. And we took it over in the 1970s, and we're very happy. Why? Because we thought we catch everything and anything with the term, and we are important as a historical discipline. And indeed, this was the outcome. By now, almost everybody who does translation in Western Asia, North Africa, and Europe wants to have a translation movement. And so I decided to go against this concept and argue with a number of colleagues who did it for specific points that we cannot speak of a translation movement in the sense of the social sciences. There is no such movement. There are individual projects, and we need to do really context studies to understand what they share and what they don't share. Preparing this talk with the term that Jochen gave, spread of knowledge, I then realized that we actually never do spread of knowledge. What we do is we take a starting point, we take an end point, and we compare these. Meaning, we have, let's say, a Greek text, we look at the Arabic translation, and we work about their relationships. What happens in between is rather something we usually do not research. And that's connected with lack of context studies. In addition to these two main points, there were a number of limited points reflecting the fragmented state of history of science in Islamicate societies. On the other hand, reflecting the multiplicity of Islamicate societies, which of course the focus on the Greco-Arabica cannot catch. At one point, I looked into the Encyclopedia of Islam to have a feeling how many Islamicate societies potentially could be studied. It's more than 450. We never get there. Yeah? So there were certain interests coming from outside history of science, for instance, in Middle Persian texts, that's before the Islamic period, and how that works into the Islamic period. Some elements within astronomy in Uyghur and Chinese knowledge transfer to Iran. Very interesting, a single paper. It's the only one where at the moment I can think of the term niche, because Muslim prisoners of war were employed in Toledo by rich Jews to copy scientific text in Arabic for them. And that may be one of the backgrounds for the Latin translations a short time later. But again, nobody really studied the relationship between the Jewish book traders in town and the newcomers from Christian societies. Other things, just to tell you briefly, translations in parts of mathematics and astronomy in India from Arabic Persian into Sanskrit, early 18th century, and also with the rise of national history of science, for instance, in Turkey, a strong interest in Latin and vernacular translations from the 17th to the 19th century in Ottoman Turkish. So far, until the late 20th century, and again, for entertainment purposes, you may know the left, I'm sorry. Yeah, you may know the left image because you can find it without problems on the internet. It's an image from the early 17th century about the short-lived observatory in Istanbul. And I point your attention to the globe in the foreground. It is a globe which probably was made or painted after a globe made in Amsterdam. On the right, a Sanskrit text And the diagram, for anybody who has ever seen an astronomical text from Islamicate societies, Arabic or Persian, immediately sees that this is an Islamic diagram. Yes, so we have these cultural moves and engagements with scholarly cultures from other territories. I do not talk about these shortcomings here, but we have in the 21st century a number of shifts, at least in emphasis and orientation. There are two new proposals concerning conceptual positions, and one by Dimitri Gutas at the end of the 20th century was something that I very much applauded to when I read it. He proposed that the new dynasty of the Abbasids who come to power in 750 and found Baghdad in 762 introduced something that he called cultural policy, a cultural policy of translation. That already is a very tall claim. The second thing he proposed is that we do not have a Greco-Arabic translation movement, but that the Greco-Arabic translation movement was caused by the translations of Middle Persian texts into Arabic. And that happened, he thought, because there was a royal translation ideology under the predecessors of the Islamic caliphates, the Sasanian dynasty. And so this kind of identification of this Arabic dynasty with an Iranian dynasty that had disappeared from the scene already for almost 200 years, for him caused the translation movement. Today, I don't believe that anymore. Why? Because there are, as I said, problems with our trust in historical claims, in historical sources. And colleagues from Iranology have by now argued that elements in these Middle Persian texts are not trustworthy. The second, even more problematic conceptual shift is the following, more recent. Military embassies of the Abbasids from the border zone to China, visiting the court of the Tang dynasty, would have seen so-called Indian astrologers at court, would have observed their sciences, would have observed their impact on politics, and would have wrote about it back to Baghdad to the caliph. And so the caliph was so impressed by this kind of information that he decided to order the translation of Sanskrit astronomical texts. I do not believe in that. There are reasons for why I do not believe, for instance, why we cannot identify the Indianness of the so-called Indian astrologers. But on the other hand, there's a historical shift. People are now arguing, in addition to Middle Persian Greek, we should also pay more attention to Buddhist and Hindu scholars who are definitely in Baghdad after 786 for a couple of decades at the very least. We have a number of other new developments that are highly interesting outside the Islamicate world, inside the Islamicate world. One of the outside things is the discovery of substantial translation activities between Latin and Hebrew in both directions, something that was not recognized in the 20th century. Together with an ERC project on the Mongol empires, there is an increase in attention to the flow of knowledge between Mongol China and Mongol Iran. And there is a bigger project in France about the Mughal dynasty in India, and again about mutual translations of Persian and Sanskrit texts in the sciences and beyond. Yeah, so there's a huge number of texts, so they give up the position that translation should be limited to scientific texts and the others should not be considered. And as you see with my sort of little notes, like astrology patronage libraries, the field of study gets broader, more into society, more into context. The same applies to the Ottomans. There's lots of intense research on what by now has been called the Ottoman scientific culture. In addition to translations from European languages, there's now a study of Persian, mainly Persian into Ottoman Turkish, the emergence of Ottoman Turkish as a scientific language, the institutions that made it possible, and the use of different types of sciences at the Ottoman court in actual politics. Very new is within history of mathematics, a turn to West Africa, where now the transfer of mainly mathematical and astronomical texts from North Africa to West Africa has been studied. And new interest in Byzantium and its concrete communities among the Christians and the Jews. The institutions are important in Jürgen's perspective on spread of knowledge. And so I sat down and listed what I see as institutions. And while I, of course, know that there are a number of institutions, I was surprised how many we can find. Yeah? So patronage is a dominant institution from the 8th century to the 20th century, late 19th century. That's new in our perspective. In the 20th century, we thought patronage for the sciences stopped somewhere in the 13th century. It's not true. The second important institution that we have not seen for a long time is the building of networks between scholars. This is particularly visible after the first half of the 13th century. People are highly interconnected, either by meeting them personally or by exchanging texts. The standard expectations about institutions are, of course, the schools, the well-known observatories, hospitals, the rise of libraries. What is new and never studied is the role of shrines. And I assume you don't know the very famous shrine in Mashhad. This became a center collection hub for all sorts of manuscripts, including all the sciences. And so by now it's estimated that there are 5 million manuscripts in Mashhad at the Astana Quds shrine. So shrines would be an interesting further institution. Another very characteristic institution that also plays into the sciences is what I simply call mobility, that has 4 forms at the very least. It's a pilgrimage, which encourage people, and we have evidence for that, to bring texts with them to Mecca and Medina and talk to people about the text. We have what I already with the networks hinted at, a very clear engagement with educational travels, starting relatively early, latest in the 10th century. First one travels to the east, one also travels to the west, one travels to the centers of the concrete period, where either teaching takes place or where observatories are or where discussions of scientific content take place. That's an interesting topic, unfortunately not very often studied within history or science, but among the colleagues from history. Wars are an important feature because many people get sort of dislocated. But deportations of semi-nomad dynasties are also an important element in the spread of knowledge, because what do these people like the Timurids, when they conquer a city, they look for the artisans, the most famous artisans, and they look for the most famous scholars in town. And if they survive the onslaught, then they pack them off to their capital or to the center of their local governorship. And so quite a number of very famous people traveled thousands of kilometers with their texts as a result of these deportation policies. Another form that is indeed important and shaped what kind of knowledge spread is basically simply saying, in which forms could you talk about the sciences? Yeah? And in which forms could you narrate the value of the sciences? And that's something we need more studies on, but one particular important narrative is a narrative about Caliph al-Ma'mun in the 9th century and the measurements of 1-degree meridian. This you find for centuries in all sorts of texts, even among those scholars that are more or less famous for being not very friendly towards the sciences. And again, a few images that you don't get too much bored with what I'm saying. The left is a miniature of the Timurid period, early 15th century, about an observatory that 200 years earlier existed under the Mongols in Iran. and the guy in red coat is allegedly Ignacio Adina Tusi. So they had the minister, another minister, and the head of the observatory. Up there is this early 18th century, one of the 6 observatory in India for a new astronomical handbook. On the right, a Mughal miniature showing a madrasa and what the ideal image of what goes on in a madrasa in a school is, namely active discussion and all sorts of age groups, male within the class. And so even more surprising is a dish. It's the only one I ever encountered from the 12th century in a city in Iran. It's about a love story, Layla and Majnun. The guy with the beard in the center is a teacher. And if you are not as blind as I am, you can see that there are girls and boys in class. And that's an interesting issue. So there is this story about Layla and Majnun go to school together. Presented here. What's even more interesting are the little tablets that you can see. And these tablets are used for orthography, so for language learning, for Quran learning, and for elementary arithmetic. This is at least what I've seen in the 20th century in such a little school in Morocco. And there are still tablets from Western Africa. You can find them on the internet. So it's a very sort of long-term static situation of elementary schooling. 2 more institutions, characteristic for a number of Islamicate societies, what I call social events. So these are public disputations. The courts enjoy having scholars sort of talk to each other in all sorts of manners, often quite unfriendly and possibly with negative results for the one or the other side. But one also has entertainment performances that belong to the political climate at the court, so where rulers, viziers, and scholars meet of all sorts of branches and exchange opinions and talk, among other things, not only about religion and politics, but also about mathematics and astronomy. And what we found some time ago, in the 17th century, it seems to be really a development to a scientific entertainment culture outside of these political frameworks. We have manuscripts for sort of the average elite, not scholarly elite, but the average sort of social elite, where all the sciences are present and are discussed. And so we can conclude from there that by then, this kind of knowledge has spread into quite a number of social groups. And of course, we need to ask for the intellectual, artisanal, and infrastructural frames. I think I'm running out of time, if I'm not already over time. So let me, let me quickly say, for some regions, in particular the Arabic world, we have quite a substantive number of sources that tell us about the scholarly communities, which is in a double sense interesting because they tell us what the writer of the biographical dictionary, for instance, thought who belongs to the community, who has a good place there, and who is rather a bad scholar or shouldn't be there. So there's a lot of social and political and religious infighting going on in these dictionaries. But for history of science, they are really important, not only those that are dedicated to physicians or to the great names in history of science that are well known, but they also tell us about the concrete, let's say, 15th century teaching of mathematics in Cairo. So they are very valuable sources. What happens is a symbiosis between the arts and the sciences after the 13th century. So we have a number of scientific texts that are particularly prominent in the spread of knowledge, in their usage across a huge chunk of the Islamicate world, because they have this symbiosis with the arts, not only because of their scientific content. Material conditions are book markets, very important, the workshops for producing manuscripts and for producing instruments, and of course the road system and the net of accommodations usually financed and commanded by the dynasties. And again, a few images up there. The building is now a quite nice hotel in Isfahan. It started its life as a caravanserai built by Shah Abbas I in the beginning of the 17th century. And it is where trade and scholars meet, because it's open for these groups, but also for poor people who come to town. On the left side, what you see there is one of the planetary theory works of Qutb-ad-Din Shirazi, early 13th century, a high-level theory work, and that's combined with Andromeda. And who knows sort of the star constellation art knows immediately that this is Abdurrahman al-Sufi of the 10th century. So something happens in the 17th century where specific art forms and high-level theory are sort of appreciated to a degree that we get more than the single manuscript with this kind of documentation. Give me one more sentence. So there are lots of things missing in this picture. Many regions that are never studied at all. It's quite surprising, but what's sort of dear to my heart is indeed that we so far did not tackle the issue how to deal with spread of knowledge. And so my desire, my hope, Jürgen, is that we would finance a large-scale analysis of manuscripts to study the distribution of scientific texts in manuscripts, to have a better understanding how these things relate to each other in certain periods and certain locations for certain types of people. And for this, we cannot do that with 300 manuscripts. That's not enough. Yeah, it needs to be really big. And the second thing, I have done a little paper this year about 400 manuscripts. We need to study the paratext in the manuscripts. What does that mean? We need, of course, to study the commentaries in the margins and between the lines. So the usage of these texts, that's a huge, important element in spread of knowledge. Who uses for which purposes, in which sense, these texts. These texts, very often, not all of them, have final text called colophon. There we get, let's say, up to 40% information about institutional context, about people we never meet anywhere else, and we can build up genealogies of scholars. So I know that because I've now seen it. And we need to study ownership marks and sales marks, because that shows how much money went into the manuscript production, where scientific texts cheaper or more expensive than other types of texts, and who are the people who buy them. Yeah. So I leave it here. As always, my talks are too long. Thank you.
Many thanks, Sonja. I would like to switch, looking at the time schedule, right away to Jens. If you could come up. Working on alphabets, dictionaries, and languages. So it's quite related to what Sonja presented, and we can hopefully discuss that as a combined package of presentations. Please, Jens Braarvig.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to beautiful Trieste. And thank you very much, Jürgen, indeed, for all you have done for me in integrating me into this fantastic research space which you have created. It's really has inspired me and given me, it has great impact to use a popular word, on me, in the sense that it has changed in a very positive way and broadened my researches, which I have very much appreciated. You have also introduced me to very many interesting people. I would mention two of them who unfortunately are not here, but has meant a lot to me, namely Peter Dameron and Malcolm Hyman, and whose untimely deaths we all regret, but the time we had together really inspired me into many things, and the small contribution I done to the globalization of knowledge, now with the changing title, is very much due to our dialogue, back more than 20 years. So we studied together the force of translation as a driver in globalization, in the spread of knowledge. And we made various models there. I mean, translation, it means really two things, because in physics, of course, as we know, it means linear movement. But translation in the more ordinary use, of course, means to put a set of symbols, a semantic or conceptual system into another set of symbols. And this movement, which knowledge takes in both senses of the word translation, I think is a concept which we have worked with and which has been somehow fruitful. And then we could say that when people translate, when they devise instruments for translating, these are very important periods in world history, because, I mean, when we read, historically, when we look at reading, you could say that the question, what does it really mean? The basic kind of question of philology is not always posed, particularly in religious settings, where texts are produced, reproduced, read without thinking what it means. But when you translate, then you have to know, then you ask the question, what does it mean? What can it mean? What are the semantic fields? What are the concepts which are moved? And indeed, what is moved when you translate from one language to the other? What is migrating? Yeah, concepts we could say, but that's also the philosophical question in a sense, which we have touched upon in this kind of discussion we have had. But one thing which is basic, of course, objects they translate, cognitive objects they translate, as we have discussed, in the sense of moving in landscape. But also, of course, when you translate the manuscripts, they move along paths. And that's an indicator along which paths translation moves and knowledge moves. And I thought today I would talk a bit about, a basic thing for knowledge conceptual flow or knowledge spread or whatever we call it, namely the alphabet, and how to use the alphabet for word and word equivalents in a lexicon, and the grammar, how to construct the language in the receiving language. So we have also had this ideas of center and periphery. And of course, the center languages and periphery languages, they are in an interesting dialectic context. Because, of course, you could say the grand cultural languages, the great lingua franca, the great imperial languages, they impose their concepts on the periphery. That's definitely something we can see when language spread, when concept spreads. I mean, we all speak with the English concepts, but we equivalent them both to German and Norwegian and whatever. And of course, this situation, this multilingual situation, is very important to understand the spread of knowledge. And also, in fact, asking, what is knowledge? What is moving? Object, yes, but cognitive aspects too. Sorry, can I have some water? So I thought today I will give a few examples of peripheral cultures or peripheric countries who devise alphabets and linguistics tools to get the knowledge systems from the center. And the fact, the choice of the outlandish, the choice of the people out there, how they choose to be part of the center, how they choose to adopt the knowledge from the center, from the standardized culture in the center, be it Babylon, be it India, be it Beijing, not Beijing, Xi'an. So we can see it's a flow of knowledge, if you like, from the center to the periphery. And for that to happen, alphabets are made. And alphabets, of course, is a very strong identity thing. And when alphabets are devised, they're always politically motivated. Maybe not always, but often, and the examples I will show, they are politically motivated. And they're also sometimes controversial. So I will start here with one case, namely the Maurya Empire in India. Emperor Ashoka, he ruled from he lived from 304 and 232 BC. He ruled from the 80s, 280s. And it's paradoxical, isn't it, that India had this enormous tradition of all kinds of literature, grammars, lexica, philosophy, mathematics. They had all of it in an oral format. So Indian learnedness, not to talk about grammar, which you can see there, the top there, Maurya Empire, Ashoka Emperor, and then we have a column on alphabets. So he created alphabet, he or his people, that we don't know, but it was created on the basis of Aramaic, and he made two alphabets. First, Kharoshthi, which was written from left to right. Oh, look at this. Here it all falls to pieces. Can you help me? Anyway, this is the Kharoshthi. It's not so well visible. Thank you so much. Thank you. But it's alphabet derived from Aramaic. Let me see, I can get this in. Yeah, that's it. So here we have the Aramaic written from right to left, and a deficient kind of alphabet, but still used in parts of India. On the top there, this earliest alphabet was devised in a deficient way, firstly, but then secondly, it was made to suit Sanskrit and Indian syllables better. So the first one is called Kharoshthi, second one is called Brahmi. And of course, why did Ashoka do this? So he seems to have wanted to emulate the Persian emperor, because he used, the model was Aramaic, and he imported and modified the Aramaic script quite a lot, in fact, but still the Aramaic background is there. And why did he do it? Yes, he wanted to display himself as the beloved of the gods, and one who did all things good for his people after he had in a battle slain 400,000 of them, according to the sources, which might not be believed. So he built those edicts, hewn in stones, carved on various materials, and in every dialect at the time, in the 3rd century BC, he devised these inscriptions of him: I, the beloved of gods, I build hospitals for men and animals, I built roads, and so on and so forth. So different. He wanted to portray himself as the benign ruler. So he had this political background. But then it seems that, well, the Hindu culture, they wouldn't write down their various manuals, their various scriptures, their religious hymns. They kept them orally. So it's only, even though they had this enormous grammatical theory, they had lexicography, which was oral. It crashes with Goody, and Harry Falk, a German professor, he has written a paper, Goodies for Goody, discussing that you can have a very developed abstract thinking culture without writing. Anyway, so this is one example. Then where writing is created for a particular purpose. My second example here is Armenia, and it seems maybe probably correct that it was this Armenian monk Mesrop Mashtots who created this writing with Greek model, but greatly modified. And if you ask the Armenians, they are so proud of their writing system. It's very close to their national identity. So for a country to have its own writing, yes, this is a strong factor in national state. But much of the reason why they did it, of course, it was to have direct access to the grand traditions of learnedness in Byzantium, and not through the Persians, not through the Syriac, because the Syriac literature or Christian literature, they were part of this space before, but since the Persians were happy about Syriac Christianity, they wanted their direct line to the direct source. And they created this script with that to translate themselves into their own national kind of Christianity. In the process, but a bit later, they translate the Dionysios Thrax, which was a grammarian. It may be disputed. Please protest if somebody knows about it here. But he lived from 170 to 90 BC, about the same time, well, 100 years after Euclid did this great work. So I find it very interesting that in the Alexandrian time, they created these two manuals, which had this enormous impact. We still use the terminology of Dionysios Thrax. It was Greek, but equivalents in Latin we still use. So this Dionysios Thrax translation, which is excellent, and you can find it Bibliotheca Polyglotta if you like to read. it was used to write the grammar of Armenian. There is no lexicon there, which is extant. And we find in many of these cases that they didn't maybe need so much a grammar, and maybe not so much a lexicon either, because it was their own language. But still, we find that there are great consistency in which equivalents they use in translation. So my third case is Georgia. They quarrel a lot, the Georgians and the Bulgarians. Now the Georgians and the Armenians, because who invented writing in this area? Because in Georgia, it was created 400 at the same time, more or less as in Armenia. And the script in the beginning, as you may see here, well, it's similar. And modern Georgian writing, it was reformed. So now it's very different Georgian writing. But this early Asomtavruli, as they call it, was also devised at the same time. So the Armenians say that Mesrop Mashtots created both the Armenian Georgians, and the Georgians naturally protest. But the Georgians also, I mean, is a modified Greek, it still is, and built on the Greek archetype, even though it's different. And translation into Georgian, not only of Christian literature, but Plato and philosophy, Aristotle, and in Armenian, even a bit of Euclid. So, but mostly, as we find in history, people who translated were mostly interested in religion. We can see that goes also for Tibet. And Tibet is an interesting case because Tibet is, you can say, maybe the most, at least one of the most organized translation movements performed in history, because it was there, and it's very well documented. So it's a very interesting case. In the 6th century, 7th century, there was the king Songtsen Gampo, which you see there to the right on top. Songtsen Gampo, he decided as a big king in Central Asia, I want to be Buddhist. So he married a Chinese princess and a Nepalese princess. He gave the order that turn me Samborta. Turn me means maybe Tibetan. No, Samborta means Tibetan, and turn me is Tibetan name. But turn me Samborta, he, according to tradition, he devised an alphabet built on the Brahmi and a grammar to help translate. So during from about 700 to 800, lots of translation activities went on and produced manuscripts like this, which are today found in Dunhuang in China, in Xinjiang in China. But around 800, when the Tibetan Empire, which you can call it, they reached their height, and they were into the Bengal Bay, and they also, just after 800, they threatened Xi'an and beleaguered Xi'an. So they were very powerful at the time. But as everybody in Asia, in East Asia, they had to have Buddhism, because Buddhism was seen in East Asia through, well, maybe 2000 or almost 2000 years as the main vehicle of knowledge beside the local traditions. like, well, maybe it's wrong to say that Confucianism is a local tradition, but the whole of East, Central, and South Asia was dominated by Buddhism, and everybody wanted to have the Buddhist wisdom. So Buddhism was a vehicle, yes, for religion, but also for logic, for philosophy, art, and architecture. So it had several, it was, yeah, I think what Jürgen called the cultural package, which migrated by translation in the double meaning into the whole of East Asia. So this is an important case, I think, of diffusion of knowledge. But nobody did it as systematic as the Tibetans. So if you read this, yeah, maybe I shouldn't read the whole, but the first paragraph here is that the Senaleg, or Chide Songtsen, he ruled from 800 to 815. He had appeased the robbers, as he called them, and the robbers, they were the Uyghur, who in the year 800 allied with the Chinese, tried to conquer Tibet. But the Tibetan forces, they stopped them. And then when they had conquered the robbers, time was ready for a revision and a new establishment of Buddhism. So that's the first paragraph here. And then paragraph 2, the king requested preceptors from the West. There are lots of names, as you could read. And he requested these learned people from India, all of them, to define the terms and to make a written word list. Number 3, the decree was issued. One shall never deviate from this list and make it suitable for everybody to learn. And then paragraph 4, earlier in the time of the father, namely his predecessors, there were done quite a lot of translations, but they were not accurate. And then, as they say, since the Dharma language was not known in Tibet, they coined many terms. Some of these were not in accordance with the Dharma texts and the principles of grammatical theory. And for this reason, it's now prescribed that the improper terms not well formed were to be revised. So after this introduction, he has this committee. They made a treatment of the basic Buddhist terms by etymology, which were translated and well-argued equivalents in Tibetan. And this list, this lexical list, also after some time was put in, there were input Chinese equivalents, so it became a very developed lexicon. But this bilingual philology or linguistics was not Indian. They were only monolingual, but the Indian theory was used for the Tibetan case. And the lexicographical, the multilingual lexicographical format, they got from China. So the Tibetan endeavor to import Buddhism by means of philological discourses was inspired from China, but imported from India. And of course, this was a very, very important political choice, because they were at war with China around the year 800. And there was a debate, what is best of the Chinese and the Indian Buddhism? And of course, the Indian fraction won. And this was a kind of autonomy argument for Tibet. What is my time? 1 minute. Bulgaria, Glagolitic, same case. The Byzantine emperor, he wanted to do mission in among the West Slavs, they made the Glagolitic writing, but the Pope said no, Mass should be in Latin. So then they stopped the whole movement, but later they came strongly back and they made the Cyrillic alphabet. So as for Old Norse, they had the runic script, but it was used just for trivialities. And then in the end, they start, we will adopt the Latin and the medieval learned tradition. And by it, the Old Norse literature in all its richness was devised with Latin letters which they borrowed. And they even made a grammatical work to see how in the late, this is the 12th century, but late 11th century, they made already then grammatical, phonetical work to study which color, how to use the Latin alphabet, how well it suited the phonology of the Old Norse languages. But this learned manual was not used. So such endeavors are not always successful, but I think that to establish an alphabet is, and as a basis for import of knowledge from the center, is points in our history line for what we do. Thank you very much.
Do we have questions? I sense, yes, Jürgen? No, afterwards, I'd like to ask the organizers to communicate this rescheduled procedures following. No, should.
No, just a comment. I think both lectures that we have heard are really research programs. I mean, just to underline this, you know, the comparative perspectives that you have developed. Sonja's presentation was an entire, you could found an institute on the basis of what she has talked. And I know that you, and I just want to advertise the volume that you edited with Mark Geller on multilingualism, where many of these things, you know, are treated from a comparative point of view. And I can only recommend it to the community. It's a great volume, Jens. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think the reschedule is, if I may ask you.
Now, we have to reschedule the talk by Montesinos to the afternoon because the service will close at some point. It's a Saturday. So we'll reconvene at 2 p.m.
Take the microphone.
Oh, yeah.
No worries, it happens. Thank you.